In a remote corner of the countryside, where the cotton fields blend into the golden horizon, lived an old black farmer named Robert. He had grown up in a region where the earth was harder than flesh, where each furrow dug into the ground seemed like a small victory against decades of silent struggle. Robert's house, an old wooden building with walls cracked by time, was neither large nor impressive. But it carried the story of a man who had, over the years, crafted his own fortune with calloused hands and an unyielding heart. He had never sought glory or recognition. His life was simple, punctuated by the seasons and the sweat of daily work. Back then, he had only the wind as his companion, blowing through the fields he cultivated with the love of a man who knew that the earth, although harsh, could offer rewards to those who knew how to plant their dreams there. From a young age, Robert had learned to cultivate the land, take care of his crops and fight against the social injustices that weighed on him as a black man in a country where the color of one's skin could still decide destiny. It all began in his childhood, when he was still a boy, fragile and helpless, watching his father work the land under the scorching sun. His father, a wise but often silent man, had planted the first seed of resilience in him. "The earth does not lie, Robert. It will give you what you put into it. But you will also have to be ready to fight against winds and storms." These words had marked his youth, and although poverty followed them throughout his life, Robert had never lost sight of this truth. He had seen the great plantations, these magnificent lands belonging to those who did not have to get their hands dirty to eat. Robert had to fight for every plot, for every grain. He was told that his dreams were too big, that his skin color was a burden, and that the doors to great opportunities would always remain closed to him. But he never listened to those who wanted to see him content with a modest existence. The land belonged to him as much as anyone else, and his ambition grew as his fields filled with cotton, corn, and soybeans. As the years passed, Robert learned to understand the economics of his profession, the art of agricultural business. He was not content to harvest what the land gave him. No, he invested, bought land, diversified his crops. He had understood much earlier that wealth was not only in the harvest but also in the vision, in the ability to anticipate the market, to know where to invest, when to buy, and how to grow one's resources. He was not just a farmer, he had become an entrepreneur. A man whose land stretched for miles, who owned state-of-the-art agricultural machinery, and who even invested in soybean processing companies. His fields were among the most prosperous in the region, and his name began to be known, not only for the quality of his crops, but also for his business acumen and perseverance. But despite his material success, Robert never strayed from his roots. Every evening, after a long day in the fields, he returned home to his modest farm, proud but aware of the immensity of the distance he had traveled to get there. His neighbors, who still remember the young man he was, also remembered the difficulty of his climb. They didn't see Robert as a man of fortune, but as a man who had to fight harder than anyone else, and because of the color of his skin, he had to fight against invisible walls that others didn't even see. However, Robert was no longer a young man. At 72, the years had taken their toll. Fatigue was starting to make itself felt, his movements were no longer as rapid, his back was a little more bent, his hands more trembling. He had dreamed, all his life, of traveling, of discovering the world beyond the fields and farms. But more than that, he dreamed of total freedom. A freedom that money and success could not yet offer him in his dusty old farm. He imagined freedom flying above the earth, beyond borders, above everything that had always limited his horizons. A private jet, that's what he wanted. A jet that would symbolize not only his personal success, but also the victory of his spirit over the invisible chains that the world had imposed on him for so many years. He had saved for years, a sum he never thought he would ever raise. He had sold part of his land to finance this dream. He knew that time was not on his side, that old age would soon overtake him, but he was determined. At 72, he knew that dreams were what still gave life flavor. The private jet represented everything he had accomplished, everything he had fought against. The hope of a man who had always refused to accept the limits imposed by society, and a final act of silent rebellion against racial prejudice and injustice. Before age and health won out, he wanted to realize this last big dream. It didn't come from wanting to show others what he had accomplished. No, he wasn't looking for admiration. But he wanted to experience this freedom before his body prevented him from doing so, before old age condemned him to look at the horizons he had never crossed. He wanted this private jet not only for his comfort, but for the affirmation of his dignity. A private jet was more than a symbol of wealth for him. He was the materialization of everything he had endured, proof that despite obstacles, a man could, through hard work and determination, triumph over the invisible. At that moment, everything in his life came down to this ultimate conquest, to prove that no limit, no frontier, was too great for the one who knew how to fight, even against the wind of injustice. And so, at age 72, Robert had finally raised the funds needed to make his dream a reality. But more than that, he knew that beyond buying a jet, he was accomplishing something bigger. He was touching on what he had never thought possible, a dream carried by decades of struggle. Freedom was within his reach, and he was determined to seize it before it slipped away from him forever. One morning, accompanied by his lawyer, Robert went to one of the most luxurious private jet dealerships in the neighboring city. It was a place frequented by real estate tycoons, celebrities, and influential businessmen. The entrance hall was a large room bathed in dazzling light, adorned with glittering chandeliers that reflected shards of gold and crystal. Aged leather armchairs, carefully arranged around marble tables, welcomed those waiting for their turn or their guests. In each corner of the room, flat screens broadcast videos of private planes in mid-flight, adorned with logos of prestigious companies and images of distant beaches. The welcome was careful, the staff in impeccable suits, the smiles polite, the gestures calculated. Every detail seemed designed to impress, to remind those who entered here that they were in a place reserved for the richest, the most powerful. But Robert was not like them. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit or an Egyptian cotton shirt. His clothes were simple, made for work, for endurance. A slightly faded flannel shirt, canvas pants that had seen many years of service, and a wool cap that protected him from the sun's rays in his fields. He stood in stark contrast to the other potential customers hanging around the showroom, poring over brochures with the air of those for whom buying a jet was just one decision among many, like buying a vacation home or a yacht. Robert was not a visitor in this world. He was now part of it, even if some here weren't ready to accept it. As soon as he entered the room, the atmosphere seemed to freeze for a moment. Curious gazes turned to him briefly, then turned away. There was a certain hesitation in the air, as if his appearance didn't fit with the unspoken norms of this place. The other customers continued their discreet discussions, focused on their projects, but a palpable unease had set in. It was the norm, after all. In a world where wealth was measured primarily by appearance, Robert was an anomaly. The seller, a young man of around 30, watched him enter with a slight movement of surprise. At first glance, he immediately noted Robert's appearance. Old, black, modestly dressed, wearing farmer's clothing, and of course, he did not fail to notice that he was accompanied by a lawyer, a detail he immediately interpreted as a sign of caution or formality. The salesman expected this man to inquire about a much more modest model of aircraft, or to inquire about rental options, where people like him could allow themselves to dream without considering a real purchase. He had no idea what history this man carried with him, or how he would transform the reality of this room. When Robert entered the showroom, the salesman stood from his desk, eyeing the man expertly, assessing his appearance with that habit that seems to come with years of service in an industry where customers never show up without first demonstrating their ability to pay. He gave a polite smile, but somewhere in his eyes there was a condescending glint, the kind of superficial benevolence we reserve for those we imagine incapable of understanding the realities of their own desire.
"Hello, sir.
How can I help you today?" he asked, in a manner that was intended to be polite but marked by a certain condescension, although controlled. It was a way of asserting control. He did not want to judge directly, but his attitude, subtly tinged with skepticism, was a judgment in itself. Robert, with a serene calm that spoke volumes about his life experience, responded slowly, unfazed by the atmosphere or the attitude of the salesman. "I am interested in purchasing a private jet. I would like to see some of them." His voice, deep and calm, left no doubt about his determination. The salesman, slightly surprised but still professional, smiled a little wider, as if to reframe the strangeness of the situation. But his smile betrayed a form of surprise which was mixed with a slight depreciation. "Sure, but perhaps it would be best to start with a consultation to determine what exactly you are looking for," he said, his words carefully chosen. "There are several models adapted to different situations." There was a touch of arrogance in his words, a way of implying that Robert, a man of his age and background, probably couldn't understand all the options available. After all, why would a man like him want to spend millions on a private jet? It seemed too big, too far from the image he had of himself. He expected him to talk about entry-level models, or at best, simple consultations to understand his leasing options, where purchasing seemed an unrealistic step. But Robert, who had lived long enough to know when he was being underestimated, immediately sensed how the salesman judged him. This furtive glance, this silent assessment, he had seen them 1,000 times in his life, whether in the grocery store, in the banker's offices, or even in large meeting rooms with his fellow businessmen. He wasn't going to be intimidated. The land he had farmed, the businesses he had built, it had all brought him here, and he had nothing left to prove to anyone. With calm determination, he replied, his eyes fixed on the seller. "I know exactly what I want." The salesman, while maintaining a courteous but clearly doubtful expression, led Robert towards an entry-level model. It was an elegant jet, but modest in size. At first glance, it seemed quite functional, perfect for those who weren't yet ready to take the plunge into absolute luxury. The jet had an air of accessibility, a sort of compromise between dream and reality. The price, of course, remained well out of reach for most people, but in this world where wealth is measured in billions, he was just one small model among many. "This model might be a good choice for someone in your situation," the salesman said, trying to hide his judgment behind a smile that was polite but betrayed a hint of condescension. He was careful not to say too explicitly what he was implying, but the words were loaded with meaning. Robert knew exactly what the seller was thinking. He expected this man from the fields to settle for something modest, in keeping with the image he had of himself. Things were simple. People like him didn't afford that kind of luxury. But Robert, without apparent emotion, gazed at the jet with implacable calm. He looked at him pragmatically, as he had always looked at things in his life, without illusions, without concessions. Then, without a shudder, he turned his eyes towards another plane, bigger, more imposing, a luxurious model of impressive scale, capable of crossing the ocean non-stop. It was a jet for the big names, for those who had the means to travel globally, without ever worrying about the practical details. Robert pointed at this model, and his words rang out with a clarity that split the atmosphere. "This is the one I want." The seller, caught off guard for a moment, lost his smile. Surprise flashed briefly in his eyes, a flash of hesitation before he tried to pull himself together. He had believed that Robert, with his simple appearance, would settle for the entry-level jet, as a sort of natural concession to his modest means. But there, faced with Robert's calm affirmation, he understood that he had been seriously mistaken. A jet of this category was not a simple acquisition for a man like Robert. This model cost several millions, far more than the seller had imagined the man could afford. "This model, sir," the salesman began, still searching for words with a certain nervousness in his voice. "This model is aimed at a very specific clientele. You wouldn't really want that. Perhaps a more affordable model would be more suited to your budget." The sentence was much more of a suggestion than a question, as if he was trying to redirect Robert towards what he thought was his real choice. But Robert, true to his calm and determined character, did not flinch. He had seen the way the seller valued him. He had seen the implication, the assumption that a man like him could not afford such luxury. But Robert wasn't the type to be impressed, not even by the salesman's furtive comments. With quiet ease, he replied, in a firm and sure voice, "My budget is sufficient. I can buy this jet without problem." The salesman, slightly unsettled but still sure of himself, backed away a little. He knew he wasn't dealing with an amateur, but his confidence was still there, in the form of one last attempt to put Robert in his place. "Are you sure you understand the implications of such a purchase? There are people who, buy private jets every day. But I doubt you're in that category. This remark, although in the form of a question, was actually a disguised statement. The salesman, without even knowing it, had just judged Robert for what he thought was his place in society. He saw the farmer not as a man who had acquired legitimate wealth, but as a dreamer or an opportunist in a world that had little room for men like him. The irony in Robert's voice, however, failed to shake the salesman. On the contrary, he seemed to sink even deeper into his judgment. I'll have to check that out. I'm afraid this model won't be accessible to everyone. Robert waited in silence, hands resting calmly on his knees, while the salesman went looking for evidence that confirmed his preconceived view. The old farmer, in the tranquility of his observation, let the game unfold without rushing. Each passing moment reinforced his conviction that revenge would not be achieved through words, but through actions. He didn't need to demonstrate his worth to this salesman. He did not need to defend what he had accomplished. History would make him listen to reason. It wasn't up to him to prove his dignity. It was up to the other to question themselves. The hour passed in an almost calculated slowness, as if the whole world knew that, finally, the truth was going to come to light. When the seller returned, his look already betrayed confusion, hesitation, and the awareness of having made a serious mistake. He approached Robert, and his initially authoritarian air had faded, replaced by palpable embarrassment. "I'm sorry, sir," he began, his voice weaker, "but after checking, you do not have the funds necessary for an immediate purchase." Robert slowly looked up at him, his features marked by years of hard work, but his gaze held a silent assurance. He didn't respond immediately, letting the salesman continue to get lost in his clumsy explanations. Then, without a word, he stood up and handed his phone to the salesman's assistant, who, after a moment's hesitation, took it. "Check that account instead," Robert said simply. The assistant, a little nervous at first, quickly scanned the device's screen. As he observed the passing figures, an increasingly stunned expression appeared on his face. He couldn't believe his eyes. Robert's account showed a staggering sum, several $1,000,000. The figure was so high that it almost seemed unreal. The salesman, who stood in the shadow of his assistant, had lost all certainty. He had not only underestimated the man in front of him, he had ridiculed the story of a man about whom he knew nothing. Reality, now striking and indisputable, fell on him like a clap of thunder. This old farmer, who in his eyes was just a simple man of the fields, had more money than he would have imagined accumulating during his entire life as a private plane salesman. The salesman swallows, words stuck in his throat. He tried to apologize, awkwardly, but his words rang empty. "I'm really sorry, sir," he stammered, as he observed Robert, as if the latter was a mystery he couldn't understand. But Robert, true to himself, remained silent. He didn't need these excuses. He had already heard too many in his life to take them seriously. He then turned without a word and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the exhibition room, unfazed. He was not interested in the seller's remorse, nor his attempts to salvage the situation. What he wanted was to move forward, towards his jet, towards his freedom. He crossed the door of the private aviation and headed with calm and determined steps towards the aircraft that was waiting for him. Stopping at the door of the plane, Robert turned one last time, his gaze crossing that of the salesman, who was still there, frozen in a form of silent guilt. In a low but firm voice, Robert spoke his final words. "Never judge a man by his appearance. You never know what he must have gone through to get where he is." His words struck the seller like a bolt of lightning. These were not criticisms. It was advice, a call for reflection. Robert knew that true power lies in each person's experience, in the invisible struggles and victories that lie behind appearances. And that day, the seller discovered, in a brutal way, that he had made a mistake in his judgment. Robert boarded his private jet with a discreet smile, but full of inner satisfaction. He had not only paid the price for his material dream. He had bought something even more precious, a personal victory. He had proven, not with words, but with actions, that dignity is not found in outward appearance, but in integrity and the work that one puts into it. He didn't need the cellar or the whole world to validate his choices. Robert had built his life with his own hand, and nothing and no one could ever take that away. The cellar, ashamed and stunned, stood there, frozen, watching the jet slowly rise into the sky, until it disappeared into the clouds. Each second passed like a reminder of his mistake. How could he have been so blind? He blamed himself for not having seen the wealth of the man who stood before him, a wealth infinitely deeper than simple material possession. For Robert, this day was just one episode among many others in a life that had shaped him. He knew that the humiliation he had suffered that day was just one note in the symphony of his life, a note that, paradoxically, had propelled him even higher. It was not money that defined his success, but the dignity with which he achieved it. And in that precise moment, he knew that it was not just the jet he had bought, but a new height that he had just reached. A summit where he was no longer judged by his appearance, but by his inner strength and his journey, the one he himself had traced.